hope you're having a good day. In this video, I'm going to talk about ethics. A lot of what I'm going to say is explained more eloquently and more in depth in our textbook, so be sure to check that out. First, I will define ethics, and then I'll say a bit about modern ethics, and I'll talk about postmodern ethics and what our textbook calls a feminist ethics of care. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm recording this at UVic, which is on the unceded territory of the Lekwungen speaking peoples. So, in a nutshell, get it? What is ethics? Ethics are how we make decisions about right and wrong ways of acting. Ethics is how we think about helping or harming. Ethics are about what is good and what is bad. It seems like it should be simple, but it's actually really complicated. When we work with young children, we're constantly making ethical decisions. We're deciding on what the right and the wrong ways are to teach and care. Often we think that we just know what's right and wrong, but it's important to recognize and remember that we've each learned our ethics. As soon as we were born, we started learning from our environments how to know what's right and wrong. We learned from our family and our teachers, our culture, which includes our religion, customs, and our media. We learned from the history of our culture, and we learned about the politics of our countries and communities, the policies and the laws that we have in place. That might have been cut off, but that's okay. So we've spent a long time deconstructing the idea of quality. So all the complications that exist in the idea of quality, like developmental theory with healthy or abnormal development and privileging some kinds of teaching and learning over other kinds, they all apply to ethics too. So what we can do is also deconstruct some of the thinking that we might have about ethics. So we can look at the dominant discourse of ethics. How do we talk and think about ethics? And where did this come from? So the Canadian Euro-Western ways of defining ethics were brought over by the European settlers who colonized Canada. Our textbook talks about how many of the historical roots of our ethical thinking come from Enlightenment philosophers. Philosophers from that time thought that there were universal ethics that we could define. So universal means that we could find a code or a set of rules of right and wrong behavior that would apply to every person, everywhere. Thinkers from that time are the modern philosophers. So we are into modern ethics. What are the cornerstones of modern ethics? There's the idea of universality, that there can be a right and a wrong way, and that we can find real and we can find capital T true ethics and rules for every person and every situation and every culture. Modern ethics says that it's possible for a person to be objective and make the decision about what's right or wrong regardless of their own culture or environment. So we can sort of see a problem with this if we think about what other beliefs were held at that time, like cultural superiority, where some groups thought that they were above other groups and that slavery and colonization were justified. We can actually see these modern ideas in our own workplaces. Every workplace has a code of ethics that each employee needs to abide by. Like in the case of huge childcare organizations like the YMCA, they've developed codes of ethics that apply to every single YMCA all over Canada, no matter the different cultures or environments. We can kind of relate this to how the textbook says that ethics are connected with liberalism. So liberalism is based on modern ideas of individualism, that everyone is a unique and special snowflake and everyone has individual rights and responsibilities. So ethics are related to liberalism because of this idea of individual rights. Our liberal politics and policies of governments are based on individual rights and responsibilities. We have the individual right to make money and compete in the workplace, and we have the individual right to get as rich as we can, often without thinking about the people who are being oppressed by the economic system. Also, if we look at this idea about ethics being universal, it means that every person has to and should believe in the same code and set of ethics, so that it's like an exchange. If we all believe in the same ethics, we all have the same rights. So when we have the same ethical codes, I have a right to something from you, and you have a responsibility to give it back to me. There's a sort of an exchange there. But if someone doesn't have the same code of ethics as us, then we could decide that maybe they don't have the same rights. Like, that's why we can have a war, because if the people don't respect the same things that we do, if we don't agree on our ethics, then we can decide that they don't have the right not to get bombs dropped on them. This is another one of the reasons why people are suspicious of the idea of universal ethics. So, what do we do with ourselves if we disagree with the idea of universal and objective ethics? We can look towards postmodern ethics, and specifically the idea of an ethics of care. So talking about anything postmodern means that we are talking about messy. Postmodern thinkers know that there's a million different ways of thinking about things, and then that's cool. So if you're thinking postmodern, you're thinking that real and true are actually just ideas that we have, and that they can change depending on who's looking at them, and where you're looking at them, and when you're looking at them. This kind of thinking can be new and it can be uncomfortable. It's nice to have simple answers and simple solutions, but when we're talking about ethics, there aren't any simple answers. Ethics of care tries to think outside of the modern box of the same rules for everyone. It's about responding to people in the moment. So context matters. Where are we? Who is involved? What cultural beliefs are coming up? What's the history of this situation? Communication matters, and relationships matter. It's not a set of rules, it's a way of thinking and doing. An ethical dilemma is when our beliefs and our values are in conflicts within a situation. So we have ethical dilemmas when our codes of ethics are getting conflicted in a situation. So an ethical dilemma that I had, when I was doing my final practicum for my ECE diploma, I worked at a small private neighborhood daycare. I thought right away that a lot of the practice that they were doing was outdated. For example, if a child was good during the day, they'd get a star on the chart, and when they had 5 stars, they could get a prize from the pink girls prize bowl or from the blue boys prize bowl. And the stars were used like as threats and punishments if the children were misbehaving. And throughout the practicum, there was one child who had a lot of energy, and she really liked to be loud and dramatic. And she would misbehave by pushing the rules and boundaries to their limits. I never saw her being malicious or cruel. She was just disruptive. And I was really upset by the way that the head teacher, who was also the owner of the center, treated the girl. She was constantly correcting her, putting her in timeout. It was all negative reinforcement. So one day in the kitchen, I got up the nerve to try and talk to the teacher. I thought about, bringing up some of the guidance method I had experience with that I thought might be less oppressive for the children. And the teacher took the opportunity to rant about the girl for about 10 minutes and told me stories about how awful the family was and how awful the child was and how she was just waiting until she could get rid of her. And the girl was also a member of a racialized minority, and I found some of the comments that the teacher made to be very racist. So I didn't know what to do. I had an ethical dilemma in this situation because I felt that I was responsible for the children. I was responsible for their well-being in many ways, and that this kind of environment was not supporting their well-being. But I was also a practicum student, and I didn't have a lot of power in that situation, and I thought that it was really important that I show that I want to be learning from the teacher, and that it's important to respect the folks that have something to teach you. I was really conflicted, and what I ended up doing was almost nothing. I talked with my teachers, and they said that the only thing that I could do was to model more appropriate behavior. And after the practicum finished, I felt really awful about not having done anything. in this situation, we can say that I followed modern ethics. I looked up the policy and I couldn't report the center to the licensing board because there wasn't enough evidence of poor care. And I followed the recommendations of my teacher in regards to the role of a student. So what might an ethics of care have looked like? If we look at what I said above, that an ethics of care is about context, relationships, and communication, I could consider in the context thinking about the power relations that exist. So there's a power imbalance between the teacher and I, but there's also a power imbalance between the teachers and the children and the other teachers and the owner of the daycare and the children and I, and also between the children themselves. And then thinking about the family, what's the power imbalance like between an owner of the daycare and the head teacher and the parents? We can also think about the cultural issues that are coming up. So the cultural background of the child and the children in the center, of the head teacher, what their experiences are. I'd also need to think about my own education and my own beliefs and values. So obviously, really valued this idea of developmental theory, and I really valued that what I had learned in my ECE diploma was the right and the best way to teach the children. You know, my guidance methods were what was going to be healthiest for them, and that I had an idea about how to like create this, you know, healthy and, you know, maybe universally good for all children education. We also need to think about the center's beliefs and values and the children and families' beliefs and values and what the rights are in situations, especially what the rights are for the children. For relationships, we can think about who I have a relationship with in the situation. We can think about the teacher's relationships with the students, and especially with the teacher's relationship with the girl and with their family, and what my perspective and my knowledge about those relationships are. So how is this situation going to affect these relationships? And then we also have to think about communication. So how am I going to be communicating with the teacher? How am I going to be communicating with the child? Should I be communicating with the family? How do I show when I'm communicating that I'm actually listening? And am I actually listening? And how do I remain open to other experiences and other perspectives? Something very important about ethics of care is that we need to make sure that we're not trying to make the other person or the other people more like ourselves, or try to squash them into our own frame of reference and think like, oh, now I understand you. Like in an ethics of care, we know that it's impossible to see something from another person's perspective because we're bound by our own perspectives. We're bound by our own experiences and knowledge and beliefs. So you can never walk a mile in another person's shoes because you don't know why their shoes fit the way they do and what their situation is like. An ethics of care perspective has a lot to do with personal choice and responsibility. You could think that response is a lot like responsibility. And ethics of care is an encounter. It's about how we're responding to others without thinking that we need to teach them our ways or that we should put ourselves in their shoes. It's about how we act in the moment, about being aware of our communication, the context of the situation, and how the encounter is affecting multiple relationships. So I hope that piqued your interest a bit in thinking about how and why we've created our own personal ethical codes and how we can learn more about other people's ethical beliefs. So good luck with the rest of the course. I hope you're having fun.